The sky seemed to hang heavy over the school courtyard, drenched in late afternoon light that drifted lazily through the branches of the old oak trees. This place was always a contradiction, a sanctuary and a battleground. I liked to think I occupied a realm outside of it, a shadow lurking just outside the boundaries of confrontations and invisible wars. Yet today, I stood between two worlds about to collide. I'd been watching him, Danny, the nerdy guy with the perpetually ink-stained fingers and eyes that seemed too deep for a world this shallow. He wasn't hard to spot in the chaos of high school aggression, especially when the usual suspects found their target. The sight of it prickled under my skin, a few of the steroid-sponsored idiots shoving him around like he was nothing more than a pawn in their testosterone-choked chess game. "Hey," I called out without thinking, the weight of unexpected impulse grounding my usual recklessness. It was enough to make them hesitate, their fists freezing mid-lunge as their bravado wavered under sudden scrutiny. They sneered at the interference, but I met their gaze without flinching, arms casually crossed, broadcasted indifference masking something less civilized. "Got a problem, Kane?" One of them shot back, attempts at intimidation as transparent as the glassy echoes of the courtyard. But I knew their game, a script as predictable as the cold wind that sliced through the dispersing crowd. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely a murmur, yet charged with enough expectation to twist the tension in the air. "He's not your punching bag." At this, Donnie's gaze flitted to mine, surprise etched in the intricacies of his expression, a perfect study in disbelief and quiet gratitude. No words were exchanged, but we shared an infinitesimal moment that felt dangerously like equilibrium. The bullies cursed under their breaths, frustration clinging to their footsteps as they shuffled away, a victory more incidental than intended, and yet deliberate enough to electrify the spaces Danny and I occupied. "Thanks," Danny muttered, almost lost in the shadows that stretched across his face. A wary smile weaved into his timid acknowledgement. There was an awkwardness lingering in the air between us, a fragile filament of connection, wary and untested. "No sweat," I shrugged, trying and failing to ignore the unsettled curiosity etching into the periphery. He didn't move, sort of standing there with the sun balancing on his shoulders, as if trying its best to make him visible. It was crazy how much I wanted to reach out and see if that sunlight felt as warm as it looked. Danny lingered beside the old wooden benches, brushing dust from his sleeve with absent gestures, small signs that he hadn't settled back into familiar territory despite his best efforts. An awkward silence stretched, audibly woven into breathing and shifting feet on broken pavement. I wished I could read people like textbooks instead of obstacle courses. "So, conspiracy theory. They only pick on the smart kids 'cause they secretly flunked their IQ tests," I offered, a sideways smile sneaking onto my lips, trying to cloak the tension with levity. He chuckled, dry and surprised, like discovering sunlight on an overcast day. "If that's true, they must have burned those tests," he countered, mild sarcasm lending warmth to his voice, a gentle sparring I hadn't known I craved. We fell into step, traversing this newfound camaraderie with an ease that surprised us both. Occasionally, his gaze flickered towards mine, a glint of wonder hiding behind predictably thick lenses. I studied him out of the corner of my eye, considering why he didn't just excuse himself and return to his usual solitary safety. Maybe he was calculating something in his head, piecing together clues to solve the puzzle of why I intervened. Perhaps he believed I was playing at the same treacherous games everything about us seemed to be built on. "Hey, you've got ink there," I pointed, aiming distracting observation at the stains seeping into his shirt's cuff. "Artistic hazard." He straightened the collar self-consciously, a gesture half rueful, half habitual. I nearly scoffed, but bit against it. There was a soft rebellion in his demeanor, like a nerd knighted in secret whispers of calculus and good-hearted defiance. I mentally noted he was the kind of person who could quietly start a revolution with introductory algorithms and enough post-it notes. His steps paused near the fringes of the courtyard, as if deciding on a path that led somewhere beyond the certain loneliness he seemed accustomed to. "Do you do this often?" he asked, suddenly shy, curiosity tangled in hesitation. The edge of his inquiry held a conspiracy I hadn't considered, a thoughtfulness in assessing motives, calculating what kindness in our world bid the uninvolved to become otherwise. Not as often as I should, I admitted, sincerity unwinding that usually slumbered in the recesses of carefully composed facade. His eyes widened a fraction, the honesty unexpected, a stark contrast against the unpredictable climate of adolescent interaction. I sensed there was more he wanted to say, questions, maybe thanks, that went beyond what his soft-spoken gratitude managed, but he didn't. Instead, he gave a nod, a gesture underscored with an unsaid agreement, unfolding our tentative alliance like paper cranes in the rain. It was enough. As I walked away, the whisper of nostalgia for uncalculated companionship rooted itself deeper, lurking like an unseen promise beneath reality's surface. Today was a departure, not only because intervention had tangled our lives, but because it had offered something fragile, precious, yearning for continuity against all odds. And maybe, underneath it all, I wondered if Danny felt it too. The world outside was still and silent, the moon casting a gentle glow that filtered through heavy drapes, like whispers of something untold. We sat across from each other, books spread out like mute witnesses to whatever fragile understanding had begun to weave between us. The air seemed charged, each rustle of paper a reminder of how unspoken our thoughts remained. Danny focused on the pages before him, his brows furrowing slightly as he considered the problem at hand. His pen scratched softly against the paper, filling the room with a rhythmic cadence that felt almost soothing. I watched him under the guise of study, tracing the lines of determination etched on his face. There was a subtle shift each time he adjusted his glasses, a momentary lapse of vulnerability that revealed far more than his reserved demeanor ever intended to show. I pretended diligence over equations that held little interest, my mind occupied instead with the peculiar dynamics between us. There was a conspiracy alive in the air, a silent agreement that our companionship, however tentative, was a counter-narrative to the isolated paths we'd walked until now. Here, shared silence became our own language. It felt like rebellion against the unsympathetic expectations of a click-driven world outside. At times, the gravity of my own history pressed against the present, its shadows meshing into the quiet of our nightly encounters. I wondered if Danny sensed it, or if he could trace the scars left by unwanted attention and regrettable choices mapped across my soul. His presence seemed to ask so little, yet offer so much, and amidst all this, I found myself yearning for something uncertain, but immeasurably precious. "I still don't get this part," Danny confessed, breaking the silence with a sigh. He flipped the book towards me, eyes searching mine for the kind of clarity he seemed to believe I could offer. There was humility in his inquiry, an openness that contrasted sharply with the guarded conversations that typically marked my days. "Let me see." I leaned closer, our shoulders almost brushing, a proximity that sent ripples through carefully constructed defenses. My hands brushed past his as I read from the page, his breath a soft presence, its warmth a testimony to quiet intimacy. Entropy, enthalpy, all those fancy words, someday destined for subconscious retention, now offered the canvas upon which our quiet intrigue painted itself. Patience wore a cloak of discovery as I explained the concept as best as I could manage, my voice keeping to a reverent murmur, a pact between us to traverse our insecurities gently. Our study session continued, each resolved question a step further into understanding, yet never quite quelling the restlessness that marked these nocturnal gatherings of ours. I found myself smiling more readily, an unchecked victory over the cynicism that was my trusted companion. As the hours slipped by, swept along by the tides of such understated camaraderie, I noticed Danny's gaze lingered on me longer than before. There was a weight to it, a hidden curiosity suppressed beneath the academic pretense. It was then, in a moment, unguarded and true, that his voice cut through our shared silence once more, loaded with something unexplained. "Why did you really stop them?" His question took me by surprise, resting heavily in the quiet space between us. His eyes met mine, a direct, unflinching connection, underscoring the vulnerability he dared to unveil. The inquiry challenged the unspoken boundaries we had kept, an invitation to reveal intentions, peeled away from protective layers. "I don't know." The confession was a threadbare truth, its honesty reverberating with raw emotion. My gaze turned away, finding refuge in the fading patterns of shadows on the wall. "I saw them messing with you, and it didn't seem right." "I'm grateful, anyway." His voice carried an unexpected depth, the words not quite laden with standard gratitude, but something else, an acknowledgement of what had quietly settled between us. For a long moment, silence resumed its dominion, both of us immersed in thoughts tangled with hopes and fears we hadn't yet voiced. Stirred by this exchange, I felt the embers of something tentative but unwavering, a pact forged without formal consent. As Danny stretched tiredly, closing his book with a reverent finality, he offered me a smile, a small, simple gesture underscored with understanding and an unspoken alliance. As Danny stretched, it was a look that hinted at chance, a possibility that had slowly started nesting within fractured moments. "I think that's enough for tonight," he suggested, gathering his belongings with an elegance that belied the subtle undertones of reluctance. "Same time tomorrow?" "Sure," I agreed, my voice steady but heart racing with the familiar excitement of anticipated companionship. I wondered what further revelations the night might choose to grant us each time we met. And so, we parted ways under the halo of streetlights, leaving behind the hushed promise of unfamiliar beginnings. In this, there was a realization, a longing for continuity against odds unknown, daring us each to tread forward into the quiet mystery of our becoming connection. The buzz of conversation swirled low and warm as I stepped into the campus cafe, a gentle din punctuated by the clatter of ceramic mugs and the hiss of steamed milk. Outside the tall windows, twilight draped itself lazily across campus in muted shades of lavender and gray, the streetlights flickering awake one by one. I could normally walk through spaces like this unseen, part of the scenery rather than the action. But tonight, my pulse stuttered uncomfortably as my eyes landed on one table tucked near the far corner, a sight that made something inside me tip sideways, unbalanced. Danny was there. Not that this was unusual, it wasn't hard to find him outside the classroom. He had a way of existing in public without becoming absorbed by it, a quiet presence who, despite the raucous world around him, always seemed tethered to something more private. But tonight, that tether was someone else. The guy, the one sitting across from Danny, leaned in closer, too close. His shirt was crisp, his smile more so, the tailored kind that slipped into social spaces like a key fitting into a lock. Danny laughed at something he said, his face breaking open in a way I perhaps knew too well by now. I didn't remember making the decision to linger, not really. My feet slowed of their own accord, and I found myself hanging back behind the beverage counter like a shadow, half hidden by the shelves stacked with mismatched mugs for sale. The words spilling between them, low and easy, were mostly lost beneath the noise of the cafe. Still, the lean of their bodies said everything I needed to know. Paired off, a perfect social balance, Danny's shoulders relaxed and his face lit with a kind of warmth I'd never put there. I hated that smile in this moment, beautiful as it was. It wasn't mine. What right did I even have to think like that? It wasn't jealousy. Not exactly. Or if it was the most blunted, diluted form of the thing, like a poorly drawn outline rather than something sharp and edged. But there was an ache nonetheless, harder to reason away than I wanted to admit. We'd fallen into a rhythm, hadn't we? Study nights, quiet jokes, the shorthand of smiles exchanged across cramped library desks. I hadn't realized how much I treasured that until now, faced with the prospect of someone else stepping into my space, someone else drawing him closer. I shifted uncomfortably against the shelf, the surface of the wood pressing into my back as if urging me to move. A dull panic gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, insistent but shapeless. What exactly was I supposed to do? To feel? Danny wasn't mine to claim. We weren't anything. Just two opposing forces who'd been forced into each other's orbit. Nothing more. I'd told myself that over and over, like a mantra designed to keep me tethered. But mantras are tricky things. They fray when you're not looking. Would it have been better if Danny had noticed me? I'm honestly not sure. Part of me wanted him to feel my stare, turn toward me with that quick flicker of concern he carried so easy in his eyes. But another part, the part held together by thinner, more fragile threads, couldn't bear it. Not here, not now. And so, when he leaned forward across the table, his laugh cutting sharp and playful, I turned on my heel and walked out. The air was colder than I'd expected, crisp and cutting, with the kind of bite that slipped beneath your sleeves and settled deep in your chest. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets and stared down at the concrete path, stretching wide and lonely in front of me, lined in the golden halos of streetlights. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the knot tightening slowly at the base of my ribs. Gravel crunched beneath my boots, the chill nipped at my ears, and through it all, the same restless refrain tumbled in loops through my thoughts, like a song stuck on repeat. He looked so at ease with him, at ease in a way Danny hadn't been with me. Or was it that I hadn't let him? The truth of that landed sour in my throat. I wasn't good at people. Anyone who'd watched me for more than 5 minutes could piece that together. And what was Danny, if not the very definition of people? Warm, open, easy to approach, but harder to pin down. I spent so much time bracing myself when I was around him, like I had to hold my own rough-edged world steady just to keep from crashing into his. But did I care? The answer was slow, reluctant, but undeniable as it settled somewhere deep in my chest. Yeah. Apparently, I did. I should have gone straight home. That was the logical choice. Duck under the covers, sink into the safe weight of my headphones, and drown out this creeping, acidic feeling until it settled. Instead, I ambled into the half-deserted quad like a loose thread snagging against the night, aimless and wound too tight to unravel. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I didn't need to check the screen to know it wasn't him. Donnie didn't text much. He saved words for in person, in a way you didn't expect. He liked the quiet rituals of face-to-face interactions, the slow rhythm of back and forth, where pauses didn't rush to fill themselves, but lingered, meaningful. I thought of that now and wondered if he was still back at the cafe, laughing with that sleek, golden smile across from him. If he'd ever even noticed I was there. The next day, I showed up to our usual spot under the pretense of normalcy I didn't entirely feel. The library was quieter than I deserved. Low hums of whispers, the occasional rustle of a page being turned. Danny was already there at his usual table, pen slack between his fingers and a notebook open in front of him. He hadn't started writing yet, though. Instead, he was gazing out the window, his chin propped against one hand. His hair fell loosely across his forehead, catching faint highlights from the sunlight streaming through the glass. My steps faltered. Is this what I want? The question rose unbidden, clawing against the back of my throat like a cornered animal. I already knew the answer. I just didn't know what to do with it. When he spotted me, Danny's expression shifted. A small, almost imperceptible thing. Surprise, followed by something softer. He straightened in his seat, setting his pen down to greet me wordlessly, with a slight upturn of his mouth. It wasn't the kind of bright, open smile I'd seen in the cafe last night. It was quieter, worn in, something he hadn't crafted for a stranger. "Hey," I murmured, sliding into the remaining seat across from him. The hesitation in my voice didn't escape him. It never did. But he didn't push. It wasn't curiosity that flickered across his features then. It was patience. For the first time, I wondered how often he'd waited for me to catch up to a conversation we hadn't even started yet. The air was heavy in the dim-lit room, a stillness broken only by the rustling of leaves outside the cracked window. It was a kind of calm that could be laced with foreboding, a breath paused between heartbeats, or maybe between confessions. I sat there, feeling the worn fabric of the couch beneath me, rough and threadbare like the tension woven into the space between us. Oliver, known to the rest of the world as the delinquent, sat across from me, eyes shadowed by the fall of his dark hair. There was a chasm there, between what he allowed the world to see and what lay beneath, in the hidden corners of his soul. And in that moment, as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, he seemed more vulnerable than I'd ever seen. It was a vulnerability carved out of scars, not quite ready to be revealed yet, yearning for something, maybe understanding, maybe redemption. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he started, voice rough like gravel beneath worn shoes. I felt his gaze land softly on me, as if testing the weight of trust he dared to put there. "But I guess there's a lot you don't know." I nodded, the small movement an encouragement more than an acknowledgement. Words hung in the air between us like a pending storm. Oliver took a breath, deep and unsteady, and for a moment I feared he would retreat back into silence, the kind that had kept us apart before we even realized we wanted to be close. Instead, he forged forward. "It's not that I wanted this life. It just happened. When you're shoved into a corner, sometimes all you can do is fight back, you know?" His fingers traced invisible lines on his jeans, marking pathways only he could see. The clock ticked in quiet conspiracies, measuring out the seconds as we lingered in uncertain territory. "You talk to anyone else like this?" I ventured, curious but gentle, nudging past unspoken barriers. "No one else listens," he murmured. The confession slipped out before he could pull it back, eyes meeting mine with something akin to disbelief. There was a wordless space between us, filled with the gravity of history, his and now, incomprehensibly, ours. I was suddenly aware of the room, the way the shadows played on the walls like ancient storytellers, the odd creak of the stairs that whispered secrets only they were privy to. Mine was an audience of ghosts and echoes, all holding their breath for whatever revelation waited to unfold. "I had a plan once," Oliver breathed, the words hanging delicate and precarious. "A real one. But when your own family turns their back on you for not being what they want..." The words hit like a storm breaking, sharp and inevitable, cutting through the quiet. I felt the sting of them, like knives freshly sharpened by mistakes and misgivings. He didn't need to say more. I understood too well the politics of pretending, of wearing masks to make others comfortable, to be almost invisible until the cumulative weight bore you down. But there was something conspiratorial in our connection now. The way each line he drew in the air with his words etched itself onto the canvas of my understanding. "You're not alone anymore," I replied softly, surprising even myself with the facility of my honesty. He glanced at me then, a soft flicker in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope, maybe, masked by hesitance, but undeniably present. "Thanks," he eventually managed, and though it was just one word, it carried the weight of 1,000 unshed confessions. For a spell, silence took over, but it wasn't the antagonistic silence of strangers, nor the uncertain one of acquaintances. It was the kind of silence shared by two souls who had dared to step foot on grounds neither had known before. "Wanna hear something odd?" I asked, attempting to chase away the last remnants of tension with an unexpected sidestep. His brow arched, the corner of his lips twitching ever so slightly. "Depends. How odd are we talking?" "There's this conspiracy," I started with gentle sarcasm, "that pigeons are actually government spies, you know?" He chuckled, a genuine sound that was warm and rich like the aftermath of a summer rain. "And here I thought my life was strange," he said, the humor easing the lines of worry etched into his features. It was a small exchange, but monumental in what it stood for. A step away from the ledge into tentative normalcy, shared laughter disarming our better judgments. Slowly, his walls were crumbling, and slowly, I was stepping through the breaches. We sat there until the shadows lengthened and the stars peeked through the veil of the night, silent companions bearing witness to the unraveling and reknitting of souls. I realized then something within both of us had shifted, an ethereal gear clicking into place. Mutual understanding, the sort that didn't require words, hovered in the spaces we'd left unsaid. In this new chapter of vulnerability, the bonds between us felt electric, charged with the possibility and promise of something we weren't yet brave enough to quantify. But as Oliver's solemn gaze met mine one final time that night, there was an undeniable certainty there, a shared understanding that whatever happened next, it would be together. The silence between us felt strangely alive, like the pulse of the earth beneath the soles of my sneakers. It was one of those nights where the sky stretched on forever, the kind of infinity you couldn't help but feel small under. Stars spilled in every direction, careless and brilliant, as though someone had cracked the universe open just to show us what was inside. The moon cast its silver glow over the rooftop, softening the harsh edges of the world. It made Oliver's features look impossibly gentle, his sharp cheekbones blunted by the light, his dark lashes casting feathery shadows across his cheeks. He wasn't looking at the skies, though. He was staring down at his hands, nails bitten short, fingers fidgeting with the fraying hem of his hoodie. That nervous energy was unusual for him, but it matched the magnetic field humming in the space between us. Whatever it was pulsating there, hesitation, expectation, the weight of 1,000 unsaid things, it was making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "So," I said, attempting nonchalance, "do you think there's a star out there with your name on it? Or are you more of a crash and burn meteor kind of guy?" That earned me a sidelong glance, a small twitch at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like a victory. His gaze didn't linger long. Still, it was long enough for me to catch the flicker of something restless in his eyes, some undercurrent that refused to settle. "More like the kind of space junk that burns out before it becomes anything worth naming," he said finally, voice low, almost self-mocking. But there was something beneath it, a bitterness too sharp to ignore. He went back to fidgeting with his hoodie, pulling at a loose thread like it might unravel the entire thing. Maybe that's what he wanted. I tilted my head, studying him the way I might study a difficult equation, uneasy, yet fascinated, compelled to untangle all his knots, even though I wasn't entirely sure I'd find a solution. "You ever notice how stars look calm even when they're dying?" I asked. "People think explosions have to be loud, but sometimes they're just quiet, beautiful." He stopped picking at his hoodie. His hands stilled, but there was a sharpness in his body now, like a wire pulled too tight. When he finally spoke, there was an edge to his voice that made my chest hurt. "That's the problem with people like you," he muttered. "Always trying to make something ugly sound beautiful." It took me a moment to respond. Instead, I let the gentle whistle of the wind fill the space, the howl of some distant car engine sweeping by. When I did speak, the words came more softly than I expected. "Maybe," I allowed, "or maybe I just don't think broken things are useless." His head turned then, eyes locking onto mine. There it was again, those restless depths, brimming with something I couldn't quite name. His stare wasn't defensive like it so often was. It was wild, almost desperate, like he was waiting for me to flinch away first. I didn't. I held it, even as my pulse stuttered and my stomach flipped. "I don't really get you," he said, his tone caught between curiosity and frustration. "You talk like you have all the answers, but you're just as clueless as the rest of us." "Probably more clueless," I admitted, trying for humor. But the air between us wasn't having it. It was heavy, delicate, not fragile like glass, but delicate like the moment before a storm hits, when even the smallest disturbance can change everything. Oliver sucked in a sharp breath, and when he spoke, the words felt like they were being ripped out of him against his will. "It's just, I don't know what you want from me. You're this guy who has everything together, and I'm—" His voice cracked, his gaze falling away again. He gestured vaguely at himself, as if that explained everything. "This." I stared at him, baffled by just how wrong he was. The image of him, the silhouette of someone impossibly messy but endlessly magnetic, someone who burned too brightly in the dark, someone who existed like the sharp edge of an unfinished thought. "Okay, first of all," I said, a little too quickly, "if you think I have anything together, you've clearly been paying zero attention." I gestured broadly to the open textbooks and half-drunk soda cans scattered around us like the debris of a shipwreck. When Oliver didn't laugh, I softened my voice, leaned just slightly closer. "And second, you're not this, Oliver. You're not some broken thing waiting for someone to put you back together." He clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists against his thighs. "You don't know me," he ground out. "I want to," I said, and immediately felt something shift in the air, a fault line opening. He turned to me slowly. His expression was a careful collision of anger and anguish, vulnerability sharpened to a fine point. But he didn't shy away. Instead, he searched my face like it might break apart under scrutiny, like he was trying to find the lie stitched into my words. He wouldn't find one. I wanted him to see that. "The thing is," I went on, my voice quieter now, more certain, "I don't need to know everything about you to know you're worth knowing." Oliver's breathing was uneven. He tilted his chin up just slightly, the fragile remnants of his defenses cracking. His voice dropped, raw and exposed. "What if I told you I wasn't?" I held his gaze and let the silence answer before I did. Then, soft as a confession, "You couldn't convince me." The words hung there like constellations drawn between us, points of light unspoken until now. For a moment, it was just us and the universe stretching infinitely overhead. The glimmer of something unnamed flickered in Oliver's eyes, something that wasn't anger or bitterness or even grief. It was quieter, almost frightened, but it was there, a wanting, an opening. Oliver leaned back slightly, dragging a hand through his hair. His laugh was soft and humorless, more a fragile sigh of disbelief. "You're going to regret this," he murmured. "Maybe, but not tonight." And then, barely perceptible, his shoulders eased, just the slightest slack in the tension he carried like armor. He turned his gaze upwards, towards the stars he probably didn't think had his name on them. And as his walls began to waver, mine began to crumble too. The world doesn't end with an explosion. It ends with quiet, small things, a breath, a glance, a pause just long enough to fill with meaning. It ends with the way Oliver's fingers shifted just a fraction closer to mine, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to take up that space yet. And then, so softly I could have imagined it, his pinky brushed mine. I was still staring at the sky, though not really seeing it anymore. The stars blurred into a hazy smear of light, their cold indifference muted by the warmth grazing my hand. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, last night's rain lingering on the pavement. Somewhere far off, a motorbike sputtered to life, and a dog gave one half-hearted bark before returning to whatever dogs dream about. But here, it was just us. Us and the unbearable silence of two people trying to figure out how to exist in a moment bigger than themselves. I never thought I'd... Oliver trailed off, his voice breaking at the edges. Never mind. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance. His jaw tightened, the muscle there twitching once before he swallowed hard. You never thought what? My voice came out softer than I'd intended, like I was afraid of scaring him off. Maybe I was. He shifted beside me, the movement careful, deliberate, but not casual, not like how he used to sprawl across the metal bench at school, all long legs and too much attitude. This was different. He was different. Or maybe this version of him had always been there, shielded under layers of sarcasm and sharp smirks, and I just hadn't known how to look before. Doesn't matter, he said finally, shaking his head. His hair flopped into his eyes, and for once he didn't shove it back. It's stupid. A beat of hesitation, then carefully, I don't think it's stupid. Oliver laughed then, short and bitter and a little self-effacing, like he was already bracing himself for ridicule. You don't even know what I was going to say. His hand pulled back, just slightly, like he was preparing to retreat. Instinctively, I followed, closing the infinitesimal gap until our knuckles touched again. Skin on skin, barely there, but enough to ground us both. That doesn't mean it's stupid, I said. It means you're scared to say it. The air between us shifted, subtle, but like gravity had tilted somehow, the pole bringing us closer instead of apart. He glanced down at his lap, where his hands rested loosely, the faintest tremble betraying his calm. I wondered if he hated being seen like this, unraveling by degrees, or if maybe, just maybe, he wanted to be seen. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, except for maybe the night he told me about the cigarette burns lining his ribs, a whisper of confession. I didn't think I'd ever find this. Find someone like... He stopped short, the words catching in his throat. Forget it. I wanted to press him, to make him unravel a little more, but something held me back. His fragility wasn't weakness, it was trust, and trust can shatter with the wrong kind of weight. So instead, I settled for simplicity. You're not alone anymore, I said, the words soft but unwavering. Oliver's eyes flickered to mine, just for a moment, but in that moment, something passed between us, something raw and unnameable and achingly real. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders eased the faintest bit, like he was trying the words on for size, like he was wondering if they could be true. Time slipped by, the kind of time you don't measure. Seconds or minutes, it didn't matter. We sat like that, our hands barely brushing, two jagged edges finding a way to fit. And then, without warning, he turned to me, his gaze sharp enough to cut, but softer than I'd expected. Why do you stay? He asked, his voice low and searching. I've given you every reason to walk away, to hate me. I almost laughed, except there wasn't anything funny about the way he said it, like he was equal parts curious and terrified of the answer. Like maybe he thought I'd been lying to him all along, and this was the moment the other shoe would drop. "Because it's you," I said simply. His eyebrows knit together, the faintest crease forming between them. "That's not an answer." "No," I said, letting a smile tug at my lips. He huffed out something that was almost a laugh. "You're annoying, you know that." "Yeah," I replied, bumping his shoulder lightly with mine. "You like it." He didn't deny it, but he didn't confirm it either. Instead, he looked down at where our hands still barely touched, then back up at me. And for the first time, I think I saw it, the choice he was making, whether to push me away one last time or let me stay. "Don't make me regret this," he muttered, more to himself than to me. But the words weren't cold, they weren't armor, they were soft, vulnerable, something he didn't quite know how to give, but was trying anyway. "You won't," I said. And for once, I didn't feel the need to overthink it. The truth was enough. He exhaled, and it was like watching a storm settle into stillness. The weight he'd been carrying, not all of it, but enough, lifted, just enough for the stars to reach him. And in their faint, indifferent glow, I thought maybe I saw the beginning of something. Not happiness, exactly, but the possibility of it. The hope. And then, in a moment I knew I'd replay over and over in my head for the rest of eternity, he turned his hand palm up, his knuckles brushing against mine. An invitation. A quiet, hesitant offering. I took it. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because despite all the walls he'd built and all the reasons he thought he didn't deserve this, I knew the truth. He did. And maybe, just maybe, so did I.